Planetary, Rebirth, short story by JameliaAlicia. There was an international society court trial that sentenced all humans that already committed a crime on Earth. There was silence. No one remembered the trial, but one question lingered. One individual, named Alexander, who gradually was gaining his memory back, remembered the event for what it is. That was deliberate. Memory, the architects decided, would only distort the sentence. This led citizens to become voiceless. Guilt, recalled too clearly, either hardened into defiance or collapsed into despair. So memory was stripped away with care. Not erased, but folded, compressed into instinct, conscience, and a persistent sense of unease that would follow each soul like a shadow. The condemned were not dragged or cast down. They were born into something alarming than one can imagine. Earth was not named a prison in the decree. It was called a living sentence. A world where consequences could no longer be deferred, outsourced, or denied. A place where time itself would enforce accountability. And so, humanity arrived as infants, gasping for air, greeted by a sky vast enough to forget heaven. For a while, ignorance felt like innocence. Children laughed. They learned games before laws, stories before systems. They were taught that life began here, that history was linear, that the universe was mostly empty and mostly silent. They accepted suffering as random, inequality as natural, death as inevitable. Yet even in childhood, something pressed inward, a sense of having arrived late to a conversation already in progress, a feeling of apology without an offense, the strange heaviness of knowing that survival itself carried a cost. In their minds, people knew they didn't have to justify their existence. Adults learned to suppress it. They built structures, governments, markets, hierarchies to explain the discomfort away. They called exploitation progress. They called distance objectivity. They learned how to benefit from harm without witnessing it, how to live comfortably beside suffering rendered invisible by borders, screens, and language. And Earth watched. The planet remembered what humanity had chosen to forget. It recorded the sentence, not in books, but in systems. Rising seas, thinning air, forests that withdrew like disappointed elders. Species disappeared quietly, as if embarrassed to interrupt. The climate began to behave like a witness finally allowed to speak. Disasters were called natural, though nothing about them felt neutral. Still, humanity insisted. We are not criminals. Crime required intent, they said. Crime required knowledge. But that was the lie at the heart of the original transgression. The crime was not ignorance. The crime was refusal. Long before Earth, there had been clarity. A way of seeing that revealed the full arc of every action, the suffering downstream, the imbalance created, the lives diminished to support comfort elsewhere. And humanity, gifted with awareness, chose convenience, chose separation, chose to look away and call it survival. So the judgment was precise. Live where cause and effect cannot be separated. On Earth, there would be no distant consequences, no abstract victims. The air you poison would be the air your children breathe. The soil you exhaust would feed your own hunger. The systems you design would eventually turn inward. And yet, despite everything, God remained, not enthroned above the clouds, not issuing commands through catastrophe. God's presence was quieter than punishment and more unsettling than absence. God appeared in moments where choice still existed and unconscious mind was a vessel for God's word. This made people think that maybe God is guiding them in their mind, in the hesitation before cruelty, in the discomfort of conscience, in the question that surfaced uninvited. Does it have to be this way? Freedom had not been revoked. That was the paradox of the sentence. Humanity was never forced to choose repair, only given endless opportunities to refuse destruction. Freedom was the door embedded in the punishment itself, unlocked, unguarded, often ignored. Some never noticed it. They mistook freedom for dominance, for consumption, for the ability to act without restraint. They widened the wound and called it growth. They inherited the earth and hollowed it, convinced that consequences were a problem for the future. Others felt the pull of something older. They listened to the land, to history, to voices long dismissed. They slowed where speed was praised. They repaired what they had not personally broken, understanding at last that innocence was not exemption. These were not saints. They were not free of contradiction, but they remembered, dimly, instinctively, what had once been known. That responsibility was not a burden. That freedom was not escape. That salvation was collective or it was nothing. The planet responded, not dramatically, but faithfully. Where care took root, life followed. Where harm ceased, systems healed. Earth did not demand perfection, only participation. Planetary rebirth was never about returning to what came before the crime. There would be no reset, no absolution without transformation. Rebirth meant becoming capable of living with knowledge again. Yes, everyone was a criminal, but crime acknowledged became conscience. Conscience practiced became care, and care, sustained across generations, became redemption. Earth continued its slow turning, scarred but alive, holding the door open. The sentence was ongoing. The question remained, not, what were you punished for? But, now that you remember, however faintly, what will you choose to become? Yet there were a few individuals who escaped their minds from being erased.